So I understand the removal now in time from your office, but who are the top 3, 4, 5 practitioners, really good practitioners of cyber warfare in the world that we have to cope with?
Well, first of all, I think that we are certainly as good as anybody, but we're dealing with the Russians and the Chinese. The Chinese have been prolific in stealing intellectual property over the years, although they've dialed it back a little bit. The Russians we've obviously seen now responsible for attacks on the Ukraine, attacks on us. There's a recent disclosure that malicious tools have been found on our critical infrastructure. I think then you have North Korea and Iran, who are not as capable, but they're more malicious and they're more unrestrained. And the truth is, you can buy a lot of bad stuff now on what they call the dark web. So these countries, although they're not at the level of a Russia or China, do have the ability to acquire some serious cyber weapons, and I think that's another concern.
Can we keep up with this? I mean, it's a constant daily battle, I would imagine.
I think we are technically as good or better than anybody, but the problem is we're playing defense, and it's an asymmetric game where the attacker just has to succeed once. Also, a lot of our capabilities are in private hands, and not every private enterprise is invested the way they should be in cybersecurity. So it's a little bit like being a hockey goalie, and you're getting a lot of free shots on goal, and that makes it very difficult to defend.
We're watching, I believe, the setup for the family photo, as they call it, and you see President Trump having some pleasant conversation with,
Well,
yeah, sort of pleasant. She's kind of like,
From Roosevelt
Yep.
and Churchill.
Yep, I'm really trying not to look at him and talk to him, but he keeps coming back at
Can
me.
he not button his coat?
I'm gonna just look straight ahead here
He never buttons
and
his coat.
hope the conversation stops. Fascinating dynamics leading up to this photo being taken. President Trump, of course, has certainly made waves in the first few hours of the NATO Summit, culminating in this picture, preceded by him entering and hanging out and walking with Turkey's Prime Minister Erdogan, and before that, deciding to enter the NATO headquarters from a different entrance than all the other world leaders were using. And before that, his performance before the cameras, addressing NATO's Secretary General about Germany. And it really, by all estimates, everybody here on the set and Andrea Mitchell and all those who've been covering these summits for decades, astonished is a word to use to describe the reaction that we are seeing among top foreign policy analysts, and also really no other explanation for what could have been behind what he was saying, except that he was doing everything seemingly to please Vladimir Putin, which really, I'm stretching my brain here, David Ignatius, to think of what other intention would be from what he said before the cameras about Germany.
I think this is a president who likes to cause instability, who likes to create an uproar. He thinks that's advantageous before going to a key meeting with Vladimir Putin in Helsinki. He thinks, strangely, that this will give him the appearance of strength, that he's willing to diss his key allies, and he'll come to the meeting with Putin in stronger shape. I have a feeling that the script for the Putin meeting will be to write some new rules for places like Syria, begin to write them for Ukraine, independent of our NATO allies. It's going to be Putin and Trump who are getting the job done. He loves that role. He up there with another big guy, whether it's Xi Jinping or Kim Jong-un or now Putin writing the rules. I must say, watching these pictures of Trump, so often you see him with clenched teeth.
Yeah.
He's kind of scowling at everybody. He talks stiffly with a few fellow leaders, but there's no animation. There's no sense really that this is a club he wants to be part of. And I think we'll see, I'll bet you anything, we'll see a lot more presidential smiles when he's in Helsinki with Vladimir Putin. I mean, fancy that.
Yeah, he doesn't like to share a stage, clearly. It's all about him. Mr. Secretary, when you were there, MS-13 has been, quite a thing that the president loves to talk about. Its origins are in Los Angeles and Boyle Heights.
Correct.
But was it on your screen, MS-13, as clearly as huge as it is on President Trump's screen?
Well, it was on our screen, and we were concerned about what was going on in the U.S. But, a bigger problem was this. As we deported people back to their home countries after they served prison terms, they were received by places that didn't have the ability to manage the influx. So you had El Salvador receiving MS-13 members, and all of a sudden they've got the responsibility to police them, and they don't have the capability. And one of the things you have to look at when you see our refugee and our immigration policy is the solution begins not in the U.S., but in Central America. We need to have the ability to help these countries build a rule of law, build a policing capability, and deal with the gangs where they're actually, gestating. Because that's what's driving the refugees, and that's what's creating our problem. So this is a system problem. It's not a U.S. problem by itself.
All right, Rick Stengel, what are your thoughts as you look at this picture and all the dynamics that we've been covering between some of the key leaders that we're looking at on this stage?
Well, once upon a time, and always until now, America was the anchor of NATO, right? And now he's the outlier. He's standing outside of everybody, and everybody there is thinking that he is this, to use the phrase we've used a lot this morning, this kind of wrecking ball for NATO. Actually, can I ask the Secretary a question? Yeah. Go back to your book, and since they're all standing there still. One of the things that you worried about, one of the things that we worried about were domestic attacks on the U.S. and the rise in ISIS messaging, which is something I dealt with. What happens when you have a president of the United States who people around the world think doesn't like Muslims, who wants to exclude Muslims from America? Does that increase the likelihood of a possible attack by an extreme Islamic group?
Absolutely, because what happens, Rick, is it feeds into the narrative that these groups have that somehow Muslims are oppressed and therefore they've got to defend themselves by striking back. It does something else, by the way. We're going to see, I'm afraid, a rise in extreme right-wing and left-wing violence. Because, again, as you dial up the rhetoric and you use violent imagery and language that's aggressive and hateful, that empowers a certain segment of the society to act out. So, just as we did in the late 60s, where we saw both extreme right and extreme left violence, I'm afraid we're going to start to begin to see an uptick of things we've seen, for example, like in Charlottesville.
Well, we're watching the family picture. And some families, as Joe pointed out, are quite dysfunctional. And what a time it is. We're watching President Trump now at the NATO Summit. And we have an interesting dynamic where the president is insulting in a bold-faced way our allies, but 97 members of the U.S. Senate passing a resolution to support NATO with only 2 no votes, and of course Senator McCain not able to vote. It is the top of the hour. With us we have MSNBC contributor Mike Barnicle, Pulitzer Prize-winning historian John Meacham, columnist and associate editor of the Washington Post David Ignatius, former Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy Rick Stengel, and former Department of Homeland Security Secretary Michael Chertoff is still with us. Thank you all. David Ignatius, the resolution passed by the Senate, how meaningful, how symbolic is that as a telegraph to the world? And or does it not have a lot of weight given the gravity of the situation?
I think it is a reminder that Donald Trump is not the only voice in America, but he's certainly the strongest. It's symbolic. Looking at the class picture of all those leaders standing together, I kept thinking if we were going to put a caption underneath Donald Trump, it would say, "Does not play well with others." That's really a problem. This is a president who, in a collective alliance that's all about interdependence, shared security, doesn't play well with others. He gets angry at them. He's jealous. If one is making too much money in trade, he wants to beat them down. If they're not contributing enough to this or that, he insists on haranguing them. the spirit of NATO collective action is still very much alive in our Congress. So many senators and congressmen have attended NATO meetings in Europe. The people who signed that resolution, I think, have a personal, intimate sense of what this alliance means. Senator Reid, who was one of the principal authors with Senator McCain so ill, was a perfect example. And I just should say, John McCain goes to Europe many times every year, and if there's a symbol for Europeans of what the durable American commitment to their security is, it is Senator John McCain, ailing now with his very serious brain cancer. But boy, there's a person who kept this alliance going and symbolized personally what it meant for several generations of Europeans.
Can I say a word about John McCain?
I'm going to end it right there, talking about John McCain. I was actually a member of his church out in Phoenix, Arizona, there off of Camelback Road. Good church. John McCain did in fact seem to be a very strong individual in state policies pertaining to the things that was going on over in the great state of Arizona. But one of the things I want to comment on pertaining to this particular movement, and we are going to focus in on that word as it being a movement. I really feel most assured that before this is all said and done with, that the American people, maybe not right now, will be able to look back, historically speaking, the historical people will be able to look back at this particular moment in 2018 during the Golden Jubilee, that it was one of the most gracefulest, predominant, wisest strategies towards allowing for the Russians to come on board with the Americans, because it was basically the Russians who woke up the Americans. It was the bear that woke up the sleeping giant pertaining to the problems not only at bay, but also the problems that we have been faced with here in America towards not being able to come together, not being able to reconcile our differences, not being able to stay united. It was the Russians that basically put the spotlight on the American election in 2015, not to dominate the election, not to influence the election one way or the other, but primarily to wake us up, to understand the severity of where we are right now and being trillions and trillions of dollars in debt, and us not being united like we should be here in America.
They have been our closest allies, militarily and strategically, for years.
And the unification of Germany was one of the great post-war achievements that was led by American diplomacy. That changed the world for better in so many ways that it was just kind of incalculable. And by the way, people didn't necessarily think it was going to happen. And one of the things that's so disturbing...
By the way, a lot of people didn't want it to happen. George H.W. Bush had to use all diplomatic skills that he had, and Brent Scowcroft, to unite Germany.
And the main person or entity that didn't want it was Russia. Russia always wanted a divided, split up Germany on its border, and the fact that this was their nightmare come true, and the dream come true, as Mika was saying, is to have an American president in Germany criticizing Germany is just, I mean, David Ignatius is too good a novelist to even put that in one of his
I
books.
know, because it would be crazy if he wrote it.
David,
It would be too crazy.
David, nobody would believe it, would they?
Nobody would believe it.
True about Russia. They would think it was preposterous. No, come on. An American president would trade our best alliance for a pact with our greatest enemy? No, come on.
So here we go. Why don't we show it to you? Because it actually really did happen. And beyond that, we'll have a great clip of President Ronald Reagan back in 1982 on the right way to talk about Germany. But first, our president, keep your eye pinpointed on his chief of staff, John Kelly, and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, because their body language is fascinating.
Also, Kay Bailey Hutchinson also looks more than a bit uncomfortable.
Yeah, here is the President of the United States.
Listen up.
It's very sad when Germany makes a massive oil and gas deal with Russia, where you're supposed to be guarding against Russia, and Germany goes out and pays billions and billions of dollars a year to Russia. So we're protecting Germany, we're protecting France, we're protecting all of these countries, and then numerous of the countries go out and make a pipeline deal with Russia, where they're paying billions of dollars into the coffers of Russia. So we're supposed to protect you against Russia, but they're paying billions of dollars to Russia, and I think that's very inappropriate. And the former chancellor of Germany is the head of the pipeline company that's supplying the gas. Ultimately, Germany will have almost 70% of their country controlled by Russia with natural gas. So you tell me, is that appropriate? I mean, I've been complaining about this from the time I got in. It should have never been allowed to have happened. But Germany is totally controlled by Russia. I think it's something that NATO has to look at. I think it's very inappropriate. You and I agree that it's inappropriate.
NATO is an alliance of 29 nations, and there are sometimes differences and different views and also some disagreements. And the gas pipeline from Russia to Germany is one issue where allies disagree. But the strength of NATO is that despite these differences, we have always been able to unite around our core task to protect and defend each other, because we understand that we are stronger together than apart. I think that 2 world wars and the Cold War taught us that we are stronger together than apart.
But how can you be together when a country is getting its energy from the person you want protection against, or from the group that you want protection?
Because we understand that when we stand together, also when dealing with Russia, we are stronger. I think what we have seen is that...
No, you're just making Russia richer. Well, you're not dealing with Russia, you're making Russia richer.
So I think that even during the Cold War, NATO allies were trading with Russia. Then there have been disagreements about what kind of trade arrangements we should go
I think
into.
trade is wonderful. I think energy is a whole different story. I think energy is a much different story than normal trade. And you have a country like Poland that won't accept the gas. You take a look at some of the countries, they won't accept it because they don't want to be captive to Russia. But Germany, as far as I'm concerned, is captive to Russia because it's getting so much of its energy from Russia. So we're supposed to protect Germany, but they're getting their energy from Russia. Explain that. And it can't be explained, you know that.
All right, so, Mr. Secretary,
Almost
And it
sounds,
can't be explained. They're getting their energy.
almost sounds like a hijacking technique of what he's talking about there. I realize that there's conflict of interest on both parts, but you got to look at the deeper fundamental investment of all this towards the betterment of the good. If you don't look at the betterment of the good, then you're not going to be able to resolve this particular issue. Once more, this is July the 11th, year 2018. This is pertaining to the NATO Summit in Brussels meeting about a week right before our chief and commander goes over to, I forgot now where it's at, pertaining to a meeting with the Prime Minister or the leader of Russia pertaining to Mr. Putin. Thank you for your time. Good luck to all of us. pertaining to peace and utopia, love, grace, all in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ of Nazareth. Trying times that we're living in. Very, very trying times. Of so many different administrations that has made so many wrong decisions in the past. Trying times.